Throughout history, there were battles and wars that are cemented in time and will forever leave their marks. But none would be remembered quite like the Battle of Alesia. In 52 BC, Roman consul Gaius Julius Caesar and roughly 60,000 of his soldiers found themselves in quite an unpredictable situation. Caesar and his men had pursued the Gallic king and chieftain of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix, across Gallic lands, until the chieftain had taken refuge in the Gallic city of Alesia. As opposed to attempting to lay a long and costly siege on the fortified town of Alesia, Caesar, a master tactician of his time, opted to surround Vercingetorix and his large force, ultimately entrapping them in the settlement, thus starving them of much-needed food, water, and other supplies. The Romans essentially built a fortification around the already fortified town of Alesia, which was a strategic marvel of its time, and a tactic that was never to have been recorded beforehand. This required miles of wooden walls, towers, and palisades that stretched in an oval-shaped configuration that would make any sally from the Gallic tribes an extremely difficult obstacle to overcome. They'd essentially be forced to lay siege to the Romans. However, as masterful a strategist and tactician as Caesar was, he did not prepare for what would transpire next. Before the Romans could construct their fortified blockade, Vercingetorix had sent out cavalry riders as messengers to hastily reach the other Gallic tribes and plead for reinforcements. Vercingetorix's plan was to prove fruitful, as word had reached the entrapped king, and even the Romans, that a massive relief force of some 250,000 tribesmen was gathering and marching toward Alesia. The relief force was led by Vercingetorix, whom Caesar referred to as Vercingetorix's cousin. Gallic tribesmen from the Arverni, Boii, Aedui, Helvetii, Nervii, Bituriges, Sequans tribes were all reported to have had sent warriors to fight Caesar in the struggle. Although the number given was 250,000, this account is from Caesar's reports and was likely overinflated. As assessed in other battles involving Caesar, he tended to have been biased in his battle reports. Regardless, including Vercingetorix's force besieged within Alesia, the Romans were surely outnumbered at least 3-1. Caesar's worst fear had come to fruition. His besieging force was soon to be surrounded on both sides, forcing him to act swiftly. It was at this time that Caesar would enact what was to be his finest piece of strategic brilliance. He ordered his men to work double time, quickly constructing an outer wall adjacent to his inner wall, thus protecting his men from an attack from either direction. At last, the Gallic reinforcements had arrived. It was now do or die for the Romans and Caesar. They would have to defend their position from two fronts with a vastly outnumbered force. Very few commanders throughout history could have undertook such a task, but Caesar was in a league of his own. Confident in his men and his commanders, he prepared them accordingly for what was about to come. On the first day of battle, the Gallic commanders sent forward large contingents of cavalry to scout the Romans' defenses, and, if any weak points were to be spotted, then they were to swiftly attack in full force. As the Gallic cavalry galloped forward, edging closer towards the encampment, Caesar swiftly organized and prepared contingents of his auxiliary Germanic cavalry, as well as Roman legionary cavalry, to leave the outer wall of the defenses and prepare a counter-offensive against the Gallic cavalry. The Germanic cavalry had accompanied Caesar throughout his years campaigning in Gaul. They were superior to their Gallic counterparts in equipment, armor, and battle experience. So Caesar was ever confident that they could hold their own in a head-on engagement. Caesar's Germanic cavalry had beaten back the initial onslaught of the Gallic cavalry. The first day of battle belonged to the Romans. However, this victory was to be short-lived. On the second day of battle, Vercingetorix ordered the majority of his force, primarily infantry, to attack in full force. He focused his men on one large section of the Roman defenses. This particular section was commanded by the ever-reliable Roman commander, Mark Antony. Witnessing the vast ocean of tribesmen emerging from the foliage upon their position, the Roman infantry were understandably uneasy at such a terrifying sight. Caesar did his best to encourage his men riding up and down his defenses, making his presence known and reassuring his men of their victory.
Show them Roman courage, men! Stand ready!
Testudo!
As the tribes closed in on the Romans, they attempted to scale the walls. They burned down sections of the wooden palisades to gain entry. In their disciplined and tightly packed formations, the Roman infantry braced themselves in preparation of the fierce fighting that was about to unravel. Vercingetorix's plan of focusing on a small subsection of the Roman wall proved to be fruitful. Mark Antony swiftly led his legionaries to cover any breaches. Vercingetorix had begun to form up his men to countercharge the inner Roman wall. However, he had taken too long, as Mark Antony and the Romans had successfully defended that section and sent the Gallic forces retreating back to their camps. The second day of fighting came to a close. On the third and final day of the battle, the Gallic tribes had opted to surround all sides of the Roman defenses, attacking from multiple directions, leading to Caesar having to spread his forces thinly. The Romans fought hard, but the sheer difference in numbers was starting to become prevalent. Caesar attempted to lift morale by riding from section to section, moving his legionary reserves to weak points in the defenses. But this would not be enough if the Romans were to survive this onslaught. and the situation began to worsen as Vercingetorix had now organized and sallied his men from Alesia and was attacking the inner walls. The Romans were running out of time. Their lines began to dwindle. In the midst of this chaos, Caesar acted swiftly. He gathered the bulk of his Germanic and other auxiliary cavalry and was able to lead them outward away from the fortress and clear of the fighting. Now being clear of the chaos, Caesar was able to form a counter-offensive against the Gallics. The Gallics edged further into the Roman fortifications, putting the legionaries on the brink of collapse. Fortunately, Caesar's men were well-trained, disciplined, and overall tough-hearted, and were willing to fight on, giving Caesar just enough time to execute his grand plan, his final throw of the dice, to save the battle and his army from crumbling. Leading them himself, he charged the bulk of his mounted soldiers into the flanks and rear of the engaged Gallics. The charges were devastating, completely surprising the tribesmen and sending shock and awe throughout their lines. Many panicked and began to flee, not realizing that they had the Romans on the brink of collapse and were soon to gain victory if they merely kept pushing forward. However, with the sight of a large section of tribesmen fleeing from the devastation that the Roman cavalry had caused, panic began to spread like a contagion. Soon enough, the entirety of the assaulting Gallic force broke off their attack and fled the battlefield. Vercingetorix and his force were left stranded by his fellow clansmen to fight off the Romans, in which they failed miserably, ultimately fleeing back within the walls of Alesia and surrendering the following day. Vercingetorix himself had approached Caesar's camp, threw down his sword in an act of submission towards the Roman commander. He surrendered himself and his men were spared their lives, having to disband their army with many agreeing to join Caesar's army as auxiliary troops. The losses reported can only be taken with a grain of salt as they come from Caesar and the Romans themselves. As such, the Romans were reported to have lost roughly 12 to 13,000 men, which is heavy losses, considering the overall size of Caesar's force at the battle. Historical accounts such as these cannot be taken at face value, as there was no such way to observe the exact extent of the dead, and thus is all speculation. Nevertheless, Caesar and the Romans had achieved one of the greatest military victories of the ancient world, and was arguably Caesar's most impressive victory throughout his long military career.